Welcome to Cross-Cultural Poetics. Poets and writers from all over the world discuss their art and their language. I'm Leonard Schwartz. Today's guest on the phone from New York is Shashi Tharoor. He's the author of 7 books, including the award-winning political satire, The Great Indian Novel, and India from Midnight to the Millennium, a study of Indian politics. He's also the recipient of several journalism and literary awards, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. United Nations official since 1978, Tharoor is currently Undersecretary General for Communications and Public Information at UN headquarters in New York. His most recent book is entitled Riot, A Love Story, published by Arcade. Welcome, Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Leonard. A small correction. I actually have a biography of India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, The Invention of India, which just came out in November of 2003. But Riot remains my most recent novel, and certainly the last thing that has any of my own poetry in it.
Fantastic. You're such a productive writer in the midst of such what I can only imagine is a demanding job.
I just don't sleep enough. That's my problem.
I guess there's enough that happens to keep you awake, and it's an extraordinary kind of output that's coming forth. So there we go, a book on Nehru as well. Riot is a big book. Your new novel, Riot, published by Arcade. Could you lay out its premises for us, both in terms of its narrative and formal approach?
Right. Well, it's a novel about collisions, I suppose, is the best way to put it. It's a novel that tries to look behind a Hindu-Muslim riot that takes place in India in the late 80s. In fact, it is based on a real a riot that actually took place at the time, and it's an attempt to go behind all of this into questions of the manufacturing of identities, the way in which people look back on history and use it to attack others, and the consequences of that in the lives of the characters in this book.
Interesting. Now, the riot and the characters in the riot are introduced to us through a series of filters, or rather through a series of texts.
That's right. I tell the story through newspaper clippings, diary entries, interviews, transcripts, journals, scrapbooks, even poems written by the characters. In other words, using different voices, different stylistic forms for different fragments of the story. And so it was quite deliberate because it is, as I said, a story of various kinds of collisions of people, of cultures, of ideologies, loves, hates, hatreds. It could not be told from just one point of view. And so I try to set myself the challenge of imagining not just a dozen different characters, but try to enter a dozen different imaginations. In other words, to see the issues in this novel through these different eyes. There was a whole controversy about a disputed mosque, which subsequently, some years after the events described in this book, brought down by Hindu zealots, and the different points of view of the different characters in the book help illuminate that particular dispute. There's also a love story in the novel between a young idealistic American girl who's both doing doctoral field research and at the same time trying to volunteer for a population control program, and her relationship with the young Indian administrator of the district, who is a married man, is also part of the collisions I'm trying to look at. But again, the backdrop is the question about the way in which identities have been constructed. It's a novel about the nature of truth, the ownership of history, and of course a novel about various kinds of passion between two people who love each other, passions amongst people who hate each other or persuade themselves that they're obliged to hate each other.
Now, was your thought in terms of the narrative strategy, which is filtered through so many different texts and therefore asks us to constantly interpret text, that the very notions of fixed identity that cause such riots are simplistic notions of narrative?
Exactly. That's exactly the point. And in fact, by having different people in their own voices, as it were, articulating how they feel about these things, the reader is able to see both the limitations of their approach and the extent to which they misjudge the others, because you hear each person speaking about the point of others in the book, but the reader hears or reads the points of view of those others and knows that they're being mischaracterized. So you've got all of these different perspectives, and it's very much, I thought, necessary to understand that when something like a riot occurs, it occurs as much because of misunderstandings, misinterpretations, misconstructions, as it does because of malevolence, which is often also there, and of reactions to malevolence.
Yeah, I thought that was a very striking thing about your novel, that there are no good guys and there are no bad guys. And we live in a world right now which generally insists on good guys and bad guys.
And usually people are good in their own eyes and bad in the eyes of others, and that's what we see, as you say, sadly, in many places around the world.
There's a quote from Joseph Heller about your work. He says, "I'm enthralled by the writing of Shashi Tharoor, his remarkable erudition and insight. For me, his work has been an illuminating introduction to India." Now, in terms of your thinking about your writing or this book, do you see your work or do you see part of your function as providing an introduction to India, or is that simply Joseph Heller's, subjective response?
Well, I was very touched by Joseph Heller's praise. He was a great writer, and his passing was a great loss to the world of letters. But yes, to some degree, it's true that I am consciously trying to scratch, if you like, at the same itch that animates all my books, which is to seek to understand my own country, the country in which I grew up from ages of 3 to 19, to try and understand what are the forces that made India and have nearly unmade it. India shaped my mind, anchored my identity, influenced my beliefs, and made me who I am intellectually, morally, and ethically. And so India matters immensely to me, and in all my writing, I'd like to matter to India. Having said that, the pluralist convictions that animate my understanding of India also go to the heart of my vision of the world, and it's from the same set of convictions and the same faith in diversity, in coexistence, in tolerance, and in pluralism that I do my work at the United Nations.
I'd like to talk about one of the main characters in your novel. His name is Lakshman. He's the official responsible for governing the town in which the novel is set. And he's also the character you mentioned that ends up in an affair with a young American woman who's doing Priscilla, who's doing work with women in the town. He is also a poet, and he has a number of different poems included within the text, within the novel Riot, as part of the narrative.
Well, actually, they're both poets. It's one of the things that brings them together is the fact they can exchange poetry. Though Priscilla doesn't like her poetry to be exposed to the light of day, she prefers to write for herself and shove her poetry into the drawer. So the reader sees one of her poems, which is about the small, dusty Indian town in the middle of nowhere that she happens to be living in and working in, and you get a sense of her perspective. Lakshman, on the other hand, is more self-conscious about his writing. He writes because it's something that he does out of discontentment with merely being a government official. And so it's something that he uses more to sort of project himself. And of course, he shows his poems to Priscilla. And the reader sees these poems very much, I can't say they're great poetry necessarily, because I have no pretensions really to being a poet. But having said that, I wrote these poems as much to convey something about the characters who are the ostensible authors of these poems, as much as I did to give the readers the pleasure of reading something different, one more perspective on the issues in the book.
We're speaking with Shashi Tharoor, novelist, author of Riot, and Undersecretary General at the UN. Could you read us the poem included in the book, The Advice to the World's Politicians?
Sure, I'd be glad to read it. It's one of the poems by Lakshman in the book. There are others. It's one, in some ways, that conveys some of the earnestness and, to some degree, some of his bitterness as well about the world he sees around him. And it's called Advice to the World's Politicians, How to Sleep at Night. Try to think of nothing. That's the secret. Try to think of nothing. Do not think of work not done, of promises unkept, calls to return, or agendas you have failed to prepare for meetings yet unheld. Think of nothing. Do not think of words said and unsaid, of minor scandals and major investigations, of humiliations endured, insults suffered, or retorts that did not spring to mind in time. Think of nothing. Do not think of your forgotten wife, of lonely children and their reproachful demands, or the smile of the pretty woman whose handshake lingered just a shade too long in your palm. Think of nothing. Do not think of newspaper headlines, of the insistent transients of the shortwave radio, or the seductive stridency of the TV microphones thrust so thrillingly into your face. Think of nothing. Do not think of the waif on the foreign sidewalk, her large eyes open in supplication, her ragged shift stained by dirt and dust, stretching her despairing hand towards you in hope. No, do not think of the woman at the building site, wobbling pan of stones on her head, walking numb for the 1000th time from pile to site and site to pile as her neglected baby scrabbles in the dust, eats sand and wails unheard. Think of nothing. Do not think of the starving infant, parched lips mute in hunger, sitting slumped in the mud, his eyes fading before his heart. Do not think of the stark ribs of skeletal cattle, unable to provide milk or hope in drought-dried lands of which you know nothing. Think of nothing. Do not think of the dead-eyed refugee dispossessed of everything he once called home. Do not think of the unsmiling girl whose once sturdy thigh now ends at the knee, the rest blown off by a thoughtless mind on her way to the well. No, do not think of the solitary tear, the broken limb, the rubble-strewn home, the choking scream. Never think of piled-up bodies, blazing flames, shattered lives, or sundered souls. Do not think of the triumph of the torturer, the wails of the hungry, the screams of the mutilated, or the indifferent smirk of the sleek. Think of nothing. Then you will be able to sleep.
You've been listening to Shashi Tharoor read from his novel Riot on Cross-Cultural Poetics. Thank you, Shashi, for that reading. I want to ask a couple of questions about it, if I may. The character Lakshman is an official, is a kind of elite official in a small, posted at the moment, a small town in India.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the advice is to the world's politicians. And, of course, you've already said something about the impossibility of sleeping, because I'm sure for many reasons. What is your relationship to this character? Let me put it that way.
Well, I suppose to some degree I was trying to imagine him because he was very much like a lot of people that I knew and that I could, I suppose, have been myself. A lot of people in the college that I went to, which is rather like the college he went to, who went into the government service, partially out of idealism, partially because it was what the best and the brightest did in India at that time. No longer the case, as the economy has opened up and given other possibilities to the best and the brightest. But their intelligence, their awareness, and at the same time their sense sometimes of futility at what they see around them and the impossibility of the tasks they're given, all of that fused into my perception of how this character would act.
Interesting. I mean, I sense that it was the figure of a possible self, of the author's own possible self, or a kind of a road not taken. How is it possible for you to work as an active, productive novelist and writer and also be in a position like you are in at the UN?
Well, I guess I've been lucky. I mean, I see myself as a human being with a number of responses to the world, some of which I manifest in my writing, and some of which I manifest in my work. It just happens that that both of them are important to me, and if I had to give up one or the other, a part of my psyche would wither on the vine.
It's intriguing, and it's wonderful that you're able to do that, and it's such a thing as possible still. At this point in capitalism, and this point in the demands of history and so on, work makes it all the more important for that reason. A couple of other questions. The book is really, it's about India, or Joseph Heller thought it was an introduction to India. It's also, to a great degree, about America and Priscilla's idealism and her desire to change the world for the better and so on. Can you say a little bit about your sense as a man born in London, from India, living in the States, and what your perception of how the book maybe reflects your perceptions of America?
Well, Priscilla, of course, is very deliberately American because there's something of America's innocence in its approach to the world that's there in Priscilla. I mean, to some degree, Priscilla becomes a victim of her own incomprehension of another culture, even one that she studied and really cares for. So this is a major challenge for Americans generally. I think there is a sense to see the world in terms that Americans understand, and not enough, I think, in the way in which it might really turn out to be in practice. The other element is that Priscilla is the daughter of an American who was an executive for CocaCola. And that, too, was there deliberately, because he's somebody who represents, if you like, a different sort of approach to foreign countries as places ripe, if you like, for conversion to American capitalism and American consumer products. There's one interesting part in the book in which Priscilla's father says to an Indian historian, you people in India are just far too full of history. You've got more history than you can use constructively, so you use it as a battle axe against each other. Whereas we at Coca-Cola don't care about history. It's not your past we worry about. It's your future we want to be a part of. We want to sell you our drinks and change you for the future. And that attitude is, I think, an interesting, relevant, and entirely valid attitude for somebody from another culture to bring in to this. But it's juxtaposed against people in the book who seem to be wallowing in their obsessions with history, with righting the wrongs, real or imagined, of the distant past.
Intriguing. We're speaking with Shashi Tharoor, author of Riot and Cross-Cultural Poetics. Yeah, the first part you were saying, there our incomprehension as Americans leading us to all kinds of big mistakes in the world at large. I won't ask you to comment on the big political issue of the day here in the States, but unless you feel free. But we certainly do witness the ways in which that innocence and naivete, putting the best face on it, does lead to disastrous results. There's a passage I happen to have opened to. I wonder if I could read it back to you and ask you to comment on it. It is on this question of Coca-Cola, because Lakshman has a dream at a certain point which reads this way: "Once I awake from another dream of falling, except this time I have splashed into a great briny, foaming brown sea, and as I rise to the surface, choking and spluttering, I feel the unmistakable taste of Coca-Cola in my nose and mouth. I plunge again, flailing, and choke on the liquid. I am drowning in a sea of Coke. When I surface again, I see, just out of my reach, my daughter on a raft absurdly shaped like an ambassador car. In my dream, I call out to her, but find myself sinking again, knowing this plunge, the third and final descent into the depths, that as I go under my lungs will be full of that brown-black liquid, and my voice will be stilled. I swear I awake with the taste of Coca-Cola on my tongue." That from Riot. Could you comment on that passage?
Well, Lakshman is, as I said, in the middle of this affair with Priscilla. He is seriously contemplating leaving his wife and child to escape with Priscilla, and at the same time he's deeply ambivalent, deeply torn about it. He is agonizing over the possible choice that certainly she seems to be expecting him to make in favor of their future together. He probably has intellectually more in common with her than with his own wife, with whom he's had an arranged marriage. But in this dream that he recounts and what you've read, there is both, if you like, the longing for the desirable consumer richness that Coca-Cola represents, that represents for him an alternative life to the one that he's living, and then yet floating on that sea of Coke is his daughter. Towards him he feels an enormous sense of obligation and an enormous sense of guilt. And that's what this particular passage is about. This agonizing about being torn from the roots, the familiar assumptions into which he is anchored traditionally as people in the situation would be, and the possibilities that contact with and a relationship with this American open to him differently. That's part of the tension that the reader faces as to what will become of this relationship in Lakshman and Priscilla, and how Lakshman will cope with the doors that Priscilla, in a sense, is opening to, doors through which, in this dream, Coke continues to flow.
Coca-Cola, from one end of the carbonated shore to the other. It's funny, I was in Peru twice. The first time I went, and everyone in Peru was boasting about Inca Cola because Peruvians love Inca Cola, and Coca-Cola tried to break into the market and couldn't because Peruvians kept drinking Inca Cola. The second time I went, Coca-Cola had purchased Inca Cola.
That's exactly what happened in India. There was an Indian drink called Thumbs Up, which was, in many people's view, a sort of better Coke, slightly sweeter for the local palate. And Coca-Cola initially found it difficult to get past, and then they bought it up, and now Thumbs Up is a minor brand of the Coca-Cola company. Though I gather they're now sort of reviving it a bit and exporting it to the Middle East from India, which is one of the more interesting transformations of the product.
That is interesting that, well, certain areas in the Middle East have resisted in very spectacular ways Western encroachment. So Thumbs Up gets the thumbs up in the Middle East. That's interesting to see it survive. I don't know if Inca Cola has found its new market, but a sea of Coke, a great image in your book, Riot. I wanted to ask you if you could read us a passage from the book. Specifically, we're talking about the question of, well, knowledge and truth and a certain kind of naivete, a certain kind of ancient or old world attitude towards truth. There's a dialogue or a conversation between Priscilla and Lakshman which involves the different attitudes towards truth on the
That's
two
right.
characters' parts, and I wondered if this would be a good moment to read it.
Sure. Well, Lakshman is sort of trying to argue that there are many ways of looking at truth and that it's many-sided and subtle and so on, whereas she, with refreshing honesty and a sort of an American attitude to this thing, says simply, either something is true or it's not. And here's how Lakshman responds. He says, Priscilla, there's an old Hindu story about truth. It seems a brash young warrior sought the hand of a beautiful princess. Her father, the king, thought he was a bit too cocksure and callow. He decreed that the warrior could only marry the princess after he had found truth. So the warrior set out into the world on a quest for truth. He went to temples and monasteries, to mountain tops where sages meditated, to remote forests where ascetics scourged themselves. But nowhere could he find truth. Despairing one day, and seeking shelter from a thunderstorm, he took refuge in a musty cave. There was an old crone there, a hag with matted hair and warts on her face, the skin hanging low, loose from her bony limbs, her teeth yellow and rotting, her breath malodorous. But as he spoke to her, with each question she answered, he realized he had come to the end of his journey. She was truth. They spoke all night, and when the storm cleared, the warrior told her he had fulfilled his quest. Now that I have found truth, he said, what shall I tell them at the palace about you? The wizened old creature smiled. Tell them, she said, tell them that I am young and beautiful.
You've been listening to Shashi Tharoor read from Riot. That's really wonderful. Between these two worlds, between these two characters, how do you locate yourself? There's something idealistic about the UN, and
Absolutely.
So where do you locate yourself?
Well, I think you can't really work at the UN without being an idealist, but you can't work effectively at the UN if you're only an idealist. You have to temper your idealism with a strong sense of what's practically possible. In other words, we are idealists with a very strong dose of realism injected into our idealism. It's the way in which we face the challenges that come to us. It's not enough to imagine ideal solutions. We have to work on solutions that can actually be acceptable to governments who provide the resources, the troops, and so on that are necessary to actually get these solutions to stick, and then we have to make them happen. And in many ways, Lakshman, working for a government and writing idealistic poetry on the side, is somebody caught as well on the horns of that dilemma, though in his case, I think you actually see him dealing with this as he deals with the riot of the novel, and so you actually find the combination of his principles and then his practical ability to try and make those principles stick effectively. And that's, if you like, the one good thing about Lakshman, who, as you said earlier, is not an altogether good guy, who has many important flaws, who has feet of clay, but you do see in his professional life the way in which he brings to bear this sense of idealism and realism, which is such a vital combination.
Indeed. Yes, there's also a character we haven't mentioned, a Sikh police constable, who's interesting to think about in terms of the balance between idealism and realism. He's Lakshman's classmate, and now they're working together to try and maintain order in the midst of the Hindu-Muslim upheaval. There's a character who puts out a rather pragmatic front, but seems to be motivated by high ideals as well, yes?
Yes, and he is a somewhat different character. He's much more earthy, much more feet on the ground, but he too has his own idealism. There's an important section in the book in which he talks about the anti-Sikh riots that took place in Delhi when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. And in the novel, he has lost his own favorite nephew to a crazed mob at the time of the anti-Sikh riots. And then he talks about how his father, who had been so proud to see him become a police officer, talks him out of quitting and says that this is your country, it's the only country you have, and you've got to preserve and protect it. So you've got to protect India the way you would protect your mother. And there's this entire dialogue between the two of them, which I don't want to summarize because it's important, I think, for people to get the whole sense of it. But it's his explanation of why he's still a cop, and he says he wants to put out the flames. He wants to save the nephew he couldn't save by saving other children like him from the violence of the mob. And that becomes a very important animating factor in the way in which he works with Lakshman to control the riot at the heart of the novel. So it's idealism, but it's idealism coming out of a very strong and even a very bitter sense of how the betrayal of idealism can take lives and do real harm to real people.
Yeah, the book is such a manifold reflection on the manifold of India through all of these different characters and prisms and texts, that kind of sense of vast possibility, a kind of optimism underlying, I think, the very form of the book. We're speaking with Shashi Tharoor about his latest novel, Riot. I'd like to ask you about a poet who I sense behind the book. He comes up once. He's the great Urdu poet Muhammad Iqbal, who's quoted early in the text and whose presiding spirit is perhaps there in the book. Certainly, some of the characters comment on the fact that he's not being read enough anymore. Could you speak about Muhammad Iqbal as poet and the relevance of his work to your thought?
He was a very considerable poet in the Urdu language in the first few decades of the 20th century. He died in 1940. And a poet who was widely admired across northern India, where Urdu is spoken and understood, as a particularly fine craftsman, but also somebody with values and exalted ideas, particularly about Indian civilization and the principles by which the country should live. And so he was admired by a lot of people, Hindus and Muslims alike. But towards the last decade, the last 10 or 15 years of his life, he became much more of a spokesman for Muslim sectarian causes, and that did cause him to lose a bit of standing amongst some of India's non-Muslims. He was certainly one of the intellectual advocates of the idea of Pakistan as a separate state for Muslims, though in Iqbal's own writings, he seemed to envisage this Pakistan as an autonomous Muslim enclave within India, within a united Union of India, rather than as a separate country, though I'm sure others will disagree with that interpretation. When Iqbal's poetry was universally admired, his song, Better Than All the World Is Our India, Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, was widely played across the nationalist movement. And I recall, for example, from my research on Nehru, that when Nehru became mayor of the North Indian city of Allahabad, he had British songs, in particular God Save the King, replaced by this song of Muhammad Iqbal. But later, Iqbal's identification with Pakistan has meant that he's relatively fallen out of favor in India. He is, of course, remembered and read by people who are serious devotees of Urdu poetry. That song, Sare Jahan Se Acha, continues to be played at important occasions and is a popular song. It's easily sung and the words are marvelous. But everyone is conscious that this man who said better than all the world is our India lent himself to the division of India into India and Pakistan. And therefore, it's also known there is a version of the same song that replaces the word Hindustan with the word Pakistan at the other side of the border. So these are some of the mixed legacies, if you like. Now, in the novel, the Muslim historian, the Indian Muslim historian in the novel, likes quoting Iqbal. It reminds the South Indian administrator of some of Iqbal's lines. Of course, one of the things that's important to realize is that the South Indian administrator grows up speaking Tamil and, of course, English from his education, and probably doesn't know Urdu anyway, whether it's Iqbal's poetry or anybody else's. But that's part of the wonderful polyglot heritage that is ours in India.
Intriguing. We're speaking with Shashi Tharoor, author of Riot. That quote from Muhammad Iqbal, better than all the world is our India, from an Urdu poet, really does suggest how recent a mint some of the fractions and conflicts are. But as you say, it does sour even within the body of his work. Shashi, what are you working on now? Any new work we should be looking for?
Well, the Nehru book is out quite recently. I did begin a novel over Christmas, but I'm afraid I haven't touched it in 2004. That's part of the perils of trying to do all the things that one is committed to doing here at the UN, which certainly cross over into evenings and weekends, which is when I try and write. I will have sometime next year a collection of literary essays coming out under the title Bookless in Baghdad, which is a title relating to an essay I wrote for the New York Times Book Review a few years ago about visiting the book souk in Baghdad at the height of the sanctions, when the middle class was selling their books to be able to buy food. And it was an extraordinary experience seeing that and, of course, writing about it. And that'll be the title essay, but there are other essays in various aspects of literary interests and concerns.
So that's Bookless in Baghdad. Interesting.
Sometime in 2005, I hope.
Fantastic. Shashi, this has been wonderful. I'm really glad you were able to find some time to talk with us. And Riot is a really great book. I enjoyed it thoroughly on so many different levels. Thanks again.
Thank you very, very much, and it's been good talking to you about the novel and about the verse in it.
Very good. You've been listening to Shashi Tharoor to read from and discuss his most recent book, Riot.